Hello and welcome to Friday Night Arcade. My name is Aaron, and today we're going to be taking a look at the NES Advantage controller. This was pretty much my favorite peripheral for the Nintendo Entertainment System, and it allowed you to have arcade action right at home, replacing the standard NES rectangle controller with an arcade-style joystick and oversized buttons for pure button-mashing goodness. It's also hard to look at one of these and not think about that scene in Ghostbusters 2, when the Ghostbusters use one along with a Sony Walkman to take control of the Statue of Liberty and drive it around New York City. And recently someone also made me aware that Christina Aguilera used this controller in one of her music videos, and, well, nothing was right about that at all. Anyway, right now I have two of these bad boys, one that's still normal color and in pretty good shape, and another that's yellowed and beat up pretty bad. On this episode we're going to take a brief overview of the controller and how it worked, and we're also going to see if we can restore my older beat up yellowed controller, and then at the end we'll test out some games and see how it holds up. The NES Advantage made its first public appearance at the 1987 Consumer Electronics Show and featured a massive metal base that gave it a very weighty, well-built feel. It had a retail price of $49.95 out the door, and nowadays you can usually find one for about 20 or 30 bucks, depending on where you look. The major selling point of the controller at the time was not just the arcade joystick and buttons, but two new features, a turbo button functionality as well as a slow motion feature. Looking at the packaging, experience the professional feel of real arcade play. Repeating firepower at the touch of a button. Delay the action with exclusive slow motion control. Bring the professional feel of a real arcade joystick out of the arcades and into your living room. With the NES Advantage, the action never stops. Just a touch of a button and you'll have adjustable repeat firing at your fingertips. And when the action gets too fast, you can slow it down with the exclusive slow motion control that allows you to plan your next move. It also has a real arcade joystick. See, it says so right on the box. These two kids look excited. Okay, so the turbo feature worked like this. You've got your traditional B and A buttons laid out similar to the original controller, but then you've got these adjustment dials above each button. You can engage the turbo by toggling the gray switch button above either A or B respectively. Engaging the turbo simulates the player rapidly pressing the button, but all you have to do in reality is just hold the button down. Once you hold down the button, the turbo goes to work and you can just let go of the button whenever you don't need it. This feature especially comes in handy on space shooters where it doesn't already have rapid fire in place by just holding down the button, and you would have had to sit there wailing away and wearing out your thumb in the process. If you choose to engage the turbo, you can also adjust how fast the turbo is working by using these special dials. All the way to the left is as slow as it gets, while adjusting it all the way to the right speeds it up. They even put a special light on there that would flash according to how fast the button was working, which was totally unnecessary but looked really cool. Having these turbo adjustment dials was a really helpful feature that lets you fine-tune the turbo functionality to whatever game you're playing, since every game is going to be a little different. Over on the right side, you've got the start and select buttons as well as this slow motion feature. Okay, so here's how this worked. Basically, when you engage the slow motion, it treats the start button as if you've got the turbo feature dialed in, but instead of rapidly pressing the A or B buttons, you're rapidly pressing the start button, which in most cases, this pauses the game. So the theory here is that if you're rapidly pausing and unpausing the game will run slower, thus giving you a slow motion effect. This technically worked, but was hit or miss depending on the game you're playing, and we'll talk more about that later. You've also got a switch for toggling between player 1 and player 2. With a $50 price tag, Nintendo was smart enough to recognize most households were only going to have one of these things, if any. So the way this worked is the Advantage actually has two connectors at the end of the wire. Plug both of these into your player 1 and player 2 controller ports on the console, and then you can flip the switch whenever you need to take turns between two players. If you were fortunate enough to have two of these and wanted to play a two-player co-op game, you'd have to flip one controller to player 1 and the other to player 2, then plug in the corresponding connectors so both controllers could work at the same time. Overall, just looking at this controller though, there's really nothing to complain about. This thing is just awesome. I once heard it described as God's own controller. Unlike its successor, the Super Advantage for the SNES that I looked at a while back, this was actually manufactured in-house by Nintendo, and the workmanship really shows. This thing has solid weight to it and feels like you could toss it down the steps and it would still go. The buttons are tactile and feel like they could hold up to even the most extreme button mash in arcade session. Traditionalists will note that these buttons use rubber switches and not the usual arcade micro switches, but they're probably as good as you could have hoped for at the time. The dials are not loose at all, and the joystick feels like an arcade joystick. This controller is also a beast. Literally, this thing is huge. It's practically the size of the NES console. It has a nice long cable so you don't have to sit too close to the screen, although it wasn't really meant to sit on your lap either. In an ideal setting, you'd have a TV tray or something sturdy to set this on in front of you and play it similar to how you'd play when you're standing in an arcade cabinet. And the rubber feet along with the weight of this thing make sure it won't skid around across the surface of whatever it's sitting on. So once you're locked in, you're good to go.
Okay, now let's see if we can get this kind of yellowed NES Advantage that's beat up a little bit. We're going to take this apart and see if we can fix this up. We'll see if we can get this plastic brightened up a little bit too. On the back there's just 6 screws. I did have to pop off these little rubber non-skid pads to get to 4 of the screws. You can see they're actually pretty gross, so I'm going to have to do a little cleaning. I'll glue those back on later, but in the interest of time, I'm just worried about getting this apart. Also, I noticed this metal plate is actually rusted a little bit, and so I may take some steel wool to this. I don't want to damage the sticker, but at the same time, I'd like to get some of this rust off. So I'll do a little work on that as well. We'll see how much time we have. Let's see what kind of shape this is in when we get it apart first. Okay, now that we've got all of the screws off, we will take off this top plate, and it looks like everything's just connected to the plastic. So, looks like we've got 5 or 6 more screws to take off. So what we want to do is we want to get underneath these switches and see if we can kind of clean this out a little bit. So if we can clean out the rubber dome underneath this, we can maybe get a little bit better connection, and we can see if we can clean this off too and get a little bit better connection as well. And then also, once we get everything disconnected from this, we can take this plastic piece separately and use a retrobriting technique on it to see if we can brighten up that plastic a little bit as well. So we'll get started on that and see where we end up. Okay, this last screw has this little kind of metal clasp that goes here in the corner. I don't really know what that does, but I'm going to try to keep it I'm going to try to keep it together so that it doesn't when we go to put this back together, I can put it back on. I have no idea why it exists, but whatever. Also, it looks like there's dog hair in here. I don't know what the hell, how that could have possibly happened. They took it apart long enough to let their dog rub their nose in it, but then they didn't actually bother to clean it, so whatever. All right. You never know what you're going to find when you take apart one of these old things. This is kind of a 35-year time capsule of gook. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to just kind of gently pop this wire out of here. There we go. And then this all, theoretically, if I got all the screws out, this should just come out. Okay, so I actually forgot one crucial step. I forgot to take these turbo adjustment dials off. So the way these come off is you'll want to take, it's a 2-step process. You're going to take a set of pliers or something like this, and what you'll want to do is turn them all the way to the left so that they're lined up with the little arrow on the plastic. And then since these kind of have a little bit of a serrated edge to them, if you don't want to damage these, what you might want to do is just take like a kind of a thick rag and maybe just wrap it around like this, and then you're going to want to pull straight up if you can, and then it just comes off like so. And just repeat the same thing on the other side. And then the second step to getting to dealing with these adjustment dials is you're actually going to need a 10 millimeter socket. And if you can see down in there, there is a 10 millimeter washer and nut. So we just have to take that out. And I completely screwed that up. So if you're following along at home, you should have done that first. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a big jumble of buttons like this. And since we've already got everything apart anyway, we can go ahead and take apart the board that comes underneath the joystick. And taking this apart already, oof, that is absolutely disgusting. So, so yeah, what we're looking for is we're going to try to clean that off as best as we can. See these little pads, these little connector pads there. Already you can see my finger making a mark in the dust and gook. And then the joystick comes out like so. And then looking at the board, you can see the places where the buttons actually connect. It's these little gold foil connector plates here and here. These are probably going to be the main ones we're concerned about, since that's going to be your B and A buttons. And then also we're going to want to clean off all of these little rubber domes that go underneath the buttons. So we'll try to get those cleaned off as best as we can as well. I'm not sure how well you can see that, but there's just... yeah, oof, that is just disgusting. So we're going to clean that as best we can, and then we'll go from there. And while we've got this connector plate off, what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of a retrobriting technique on that. You can already see, if you look down in the hole where the dials went, you can see what the plastic used to look like. Same thing on the back side. This is much brighter on the back side than it is on the front side. You can tell all the areas that were exposed. So what we're going to do is we're going to submerge this in hydrogen peroxide and then expose it to UV light. We're actually just going to set it outside in a pan, and we'll see after it sits outside for a while if that. Oof. Yeah, and I'm going to try to clean this off before I even do that. So let me get some Windex first and see if I can clean this off. All right, now that I've got most of the surface dust off of this cover piece, I'm going to get this soaking in some Retrobrite and get it set outside. There's still a few hours of daylight left, so hopefully we'll be able to get this finished up by the end of the day. Okay. Now I'm going to take some isopropyl alcohol and see if I can clean this board up and all these little rubber contact pieces as best as I can. Consider this a friendly reminder from Friday Night Arcade to always clean your ball. Okay, so I rinsed all of these little plastic pieces off just in the kitchen sink to see if I could get all the dirt off of these. And basically anything with the rubber dome or the rubber pieces that go underneath the buttons, I hit these with isopropyl alcohol as best I could to try to get as much of the dirt off there as I could. And as for the rubber feet, there is just not much to be done with these. They are in pretty bad shape. So I may just see if I can find some new ones similar to this that I could order offline and then just replace them. It looks like at one point they maybe tried to use electrical tape on some of these, and that just made more residue and more funk. So, I don't know about those. Looking at this metal plate, this does have a lot of rust on it, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try a little bit of steel wool, and I'm just going to kind of go gently on this to see if I can get some of this rust to come off. Well, I wasn't really getting anywhere with the steel wool, and I got impatient, so I got the sandpaper out, and about all that did was end up taking most of the paint off. If you look at the other side, it was actually originally had a kind of a black paint coating on it. You know, if I had more time, I would sand this the rest of the way down and repaint it, but like I said, I really didn't want to damage the sticker. And in the interest of time, I really just wanted to get the thing working again, so I'm not too worried about this back plate right now. So at this point, all of the buttons are cleaned off about as good as they're going to get. I've got all these little rubber connection pieces cleaned off as good as they're going to be. All the contacts are cleaned. So now there's nothing else to do except wait a couple hours and see how our plastic cover piece is coming along. Okay, so what I've done here is I've actually soaked that top plate in 3% hydrogen peroxide and then covered it in saran wrap, so it's completely submerged and covered. And it's been sitting outside under the sun for probably about 4 hours now. So we're just going to take this off and see if chemistry did its thing. And looking at this, oh, I can already tell it's really warm. That water is really warm from sitting outside. And yes, comparing it to the back, it's not quite as bright as the back. It's still a little yellow. It might have benefited from a few more hours of soaking, and maybe at some point I'll take it apart again and let it sit out all day. But this already looks quite a bit better, so let's go ahead and get her put back together and test this thing out. Okay, now that we've got the innards all put back together, now that I've got this under the light, I can tell that doing the Retrobrite technique helped, but definitely didn't get it back up to probably the level that I had hoped. And to be fair, I had only really left it out there for maybe 3.5 hours or so. Probably really needed maybe like all day, since it was in pretty bad shape. But the good thing is that cleaning all of the buttons definitely helped. I can definitely tell quite a big difference as far as just how responsive those are. We definitely cleaned everything out, so it should run a lot better. And that's really what I was going for here, was optimum functionality. So now we can put the adjustment dials back in there. So first we're going to put we'll put the washer in. Go ahead and put that in on each side. And then we can go ahead and put the nut in. And we want to try to make sure that that is, try to get it as flat as you can. Okay, and last but not least, we'll get our trusty arcade ball back into place. Just screws on like so. And now we can try this thing out and see how she works.
Super Mario Bros. Probably everyone's first NES game. They even mention this one right on the packaging specifically for the Advantage, although I'm personally just not a fan of using an arcade stick for platformers. It's probably because having the standard rectangle controller is so seared into my brain that my muscle memory just prohibits me from playing the game this way. Doing the precise jumps and timing just doesn't work as well with the controls spread out like this. What can I say? I'm just all thumbs when it comes to these games, man. Functionally, the controller works great and is very responsive. It's just not my preferred way of playing this type of game. The turbo features aren't much use either, since Mario can't seem to fire more than 2 shots at a time with the fire flower anyway. The slow motion feature doesn't really work as intended either. I mentioned earlier sometimes this function was hit or miss, and here's an example. In Super Mario Bros., it takes about a half a second or so for the game to register the pause command from the controller, which is fine, but the Advantage is sending the start button inputs so fast that the game can't register them all at once, and you end up with the game stopping and starting every half a second or so. Next up, RC Pro-Am. This is one of my favorite games. I used to play Super Off-Road on an arcade machine at the local bowling alley, so playing an overhead racer like this via arcade stick feels totally normal. There's not much use for turbo since holding down the B button steps on the gas anyway, and you wouldn't really want to use it for the A button since you'd end up wasting all of your special attacks. The slow-mo feature is, totally worthless on this game. It's pausing and unpausing the game at such a high rate that you can't make any forward progress at all. but steering with the arcade stick, avoiding hazards, and navigating around hairpin turns is just awesome. I'd totally use the NES Advantage as a go-to controller for this game. Top Gun. Oh yeah, we're going there. This was actually the first additional game that I got with my NES as a Christmas present to go along with the included Super Mario Bros. Duck Hunt cartridge. So yeah, I'd be lying if I said Top Gun was my favorite game ever. It wasn't much fun at the time, and it didn't really age well either. But I gotta say, using the NES Advantage makes this game very playable and actually fun in a whole different way. Using the joystick to steer your plane makes it feel like you're right inside the cockpit. It's a very different method of steering that's just not really possible with the simple D-pad. Losing enemies on your tail or locking onto enemies with missiles has a much more realistic feel to it with the arcade controls. The turbo feature is helpful for your plane's machine gun weapon, since otherwise you'd have to sit there and mash on the button yourself. Slow-mo is a non-factor, you can't pause the game. But otherwise, yeah, I have to confess, using the NES Advantage on this game kinda makes me want to play the whole game again. And that's an accomplishment. Hey, I even landed the plane on the first try. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game. Hey, it's an arcade game, so let's play it with an arcade joystick, right? This definitely feels kinda like playing it in the arcades. The NES port certainly had its limitations, but having the arcade controls is a nice touch. Similar to Super Mario Bros., I'm probably more used to playing this on the original NES controller and D-pad, so it may just be a personal bias, but my muscle memory is making precise jumps and special moves feel not quite as tight for me as it would with the standard controller. Your mileage may vary though, so it's definitely still worth trying for a more proper arcade experience. I could see myself playing through the whole game this way, but I think later on in the game against some of the super difficult bosses like Shredder, I'd probably want to switch back to the D-pad. But it would still be cool if you had two people playing co-op like this. There's also not much use for either of the turbo buttons since you're going to want manual control over jumping and using your weapon. This would also be a good time to point out this controller is actually really noisy. In a game like this, you're going to be mashing buttons and anyone in the room over is totally going to hear you going to town on this thing. The slow-mo feature actually works for this game, although it's not perfect. It helps a little bit, especially with these jerks, but there's a catch. Since the game is pausing and unpausing so fast, depending on when you go to press A or B, it's possible the game may be paused during that split second when you sent the button input. So in that situation, the game isn't going to know that you tried to jump or swing your weapon, and you'll just be standing there like a goober. You have to compensate for this by just always rapidly pressing the button anytime you're using the slow-mo feature. Realistically, I couldn't see myself using slow-mo for long in a game like this, but in general, the NES Advantage works great for this game, and I think it would be a lot of fun to try with two players this way as well. Gradius. This game has some of my favorite box art of all time. I love this game even though I'm terrible at it and genuinely dreadful at space shooters in general. I feel like this type of game is what the developers had in mind when they were coming up with this controller though. I'd be curious to know whether speedrunners would ever use the Advantage for something like this or if they prefer the D-pad. Being awful at shmups myself, it's tough to know the difference, but the controls all feel smooth. Steering your ship around at awkward angles to dodge enemies feels precise, and this definitely makes it feel like you're playing an arcade game, which I think is the whole point. You can dial up turbo for the ship's main weapon, and the slow motion even works. I'll leave you to debate the cheating ethics of using the NES Advantage slow motion feature in the comments below. Which is worse, the NES Advantage exploiting the game's pause mechanic, which is already built into the game, or something like the Game Genie, which manipulates the game's code to give you something like infinity lives or invulnerability. Star Voyager. If you like Star Master on Atari, you'll like Star Voyager. You have a navigation screen and can warp around the galaxy to planets to pick up power-ups, visit refueling stations, and warp to known enemy locations. This game is open-ended, and you're free to roam around the galaxy in whatever order you want. Using the NES Advantage joystick to steer this thing is just fantastic. It makes it feel like you're in the cockpit of your very own spaceship, and I could fritter an hour away just tooling around space not doing anything. Dial up turbo for your ship's main weapon and you're all set. And I like having the select button off to the side for bringing up the ship's navigation menu. I don't know, it kinda just makes it feel like you're pressing random buttons on the dashboard of your own spaceship. As a side note, I think I really need to give this game some closer attention in a standalone video sometime down the road. What do you think? And last but not least, it's Pac-Man. What can you say? It's just Pac-Man. You can't get much more arcade than that. Sometimes the simple things are the best things. You don't need fancy turbo buttons or a silly slow motion switch, just a callback to the straightforward times of arcade classics that were easy and fun to play. This may not be the best version of Pac-Man available, but having a nice arcade joystick to play this classic game is sure to make you feel like you're back in the arcades again. The result would probably feel the same with just about any NES arcade port if you wanted to use the Advantage. So if you like Pac-Man or arcade games in general and just want to recreate that nostalgic arcade feeling, picking up an NES Advantage and scooping up as many NES arcade ports as you could find is certainly not the worst idea in the world. Well, what did you think? Did you have an NES Advantage growing up? Did you prefer the Advantage over the regular NES controller? What were some of your other favorite games to play with the NES Advantage? As always, thank you so much for watching. Please don't text and drive, and I'll see you next time on Friday Night Arcade.